Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Ever felt like your competence is challenged and your views ignored as a woman in the workplace? You're not alone if you have. Most women have a tale to tell about being underestimated, talked over, ignored, patronised, and generally not taken as seriously as their male counterparts. This phenomenon is known as the authority gap, and my guest today is going to shine a light on this subject for us, sharing what the authority gap is, how it impacts us as women, and most importantly, what we can do about it. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Mary Ann Sieghart. She's a journalist, broadcaster, and author of the best-selling book, The Authority Gap: Why Women Are Still Taken Less Seriously Than Men and What We Can Do About It. In this interview, we explore the covert bias that many women experience and the effects it can have on us personally and professionally. We look at how you can recognise it, how you can correctly apportion it, and start to narrow the authority gap. I know this is going to be such a powerful conversation, and I can't wait to dive into it with Mary Ann. So welcome, Mary Ann. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
I've kind of read your book and was so impressed, and I've shared this with you, so impressed with the research that you've done in this area. They were so insightful, and as somebody who loves research, I was particularly appreciated how much you combined really all of the various studies in this area with kind of the anecdotal experience of people in your book. But I'm curious, what actually inspired you to decide to write the book in the first place?
I think it was just a lifetime of both experiencing the authority gap myself and seeing it happen to other women. And I had, over the course of that time, written quite a few newspaper columns on this sort of subject. And it just started to coalesce into a theme for me. And I realised that no one else had written this book. No one else had drawn together all the research from so many fields, or indeed talk to women themselves to find out, to what extent this was an everyday experience for them. And so I thought it would be really useful, both for women readers to understand that this is genuinely a systemic problem and it's nothing personal to them, and also for male readers who I think are often so unaware that this even goes on.
Yeah, massively. So obviously your book is called The Authority Gap. So what actually do you mean when you use that term?
The authority gap is a measure of how much more seriously we still take men than women. So we're still much more reluctant to accord authority to women than to men. We still assume a man knows what he's talking about until he proves otherwise, whereas for a woman, it's all too often the other way round. And we're also more reluctant to accord authority to women in terms of power as well as expertise. So when women are leaders, we often feel more uncomfortable with that than we do when men are leaders. And, still quite a lot of people all over the world think that women just simply aren't suited to holding power, to running big corporations or to being heads of government. So there's still quite a lot of bias left, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and your book speaks so brilliantly to it because you talk about kind of the subtlety of it sometimes, but also sometimes it can be very explicit. And as you say, you talk about the difference between the knowledge and expertise of authority, but also the power and leadership piece. And I loved that your book starts with the story of the Irish president and the Pope, if that's right. I wonder if you could just share a little bit of that story that was told to you in one of your interviews.
Yeah, so I conducted about 40 interviews with very, very successful and powerful women, as well as women from other walks of life. But I deliberately chose these former prime ministers and presidents and Supreme Court justices and bishops and generals and that sort of thing, because I thought, if this sort of behaviour of being disrespected and underestimated and undermined has happened even to women right at the top of their game, then that is pretty good proof that it happens to the whole of humankind. Sorry, I'm going to retake that. That is pretty good proof that it happens to the whole of womankind. And this particular story came from Mary McAleese, who was president of Ireland. And she told me that she led a delegation to the Vatican to meet the Pope. So it was an incredibly formal occasion. And there she is at the head of her delegation in the audience room. And the Pope comes in, flanked by his cardinals, to be introduced to the visiting president. And he walks straight past her, holds out his hand to her husband instead, who's standing next to her, and says, "Wouldn't you prefer to be president rather than married to the president?" And the delegation is stunned by the, sheer rudeness of this, not to mention the breach of diplomatic protocol, because he's supposed to be introduced to the president. And her husband, of course, knows better than to take the Pope's hand. So Mary McAleese grabs this hand, which is just hovering in midair, brings it back to herself and says, "Let me introduce myself. I am the President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, elected by the people of Ireland, whether you like it or whether you don't." And he said afterwards, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just making a joke. I was told you had a sense of humor." Well, right. How many times have women heard, don't be so humorless. I was just making a joke when someone says something sexist. And she said, "Well, I do have a sense of humor, but that really wasn't funny because you would not have said that to a male president." And I say so often in the book how much it helps to flip things round. If you wouldn't do it to a man, then don't do it to a woman. And I also suggest that men flip things round in order to appreciate the authority gap in the first place. So I say, imagine living in a world in which you're routinely underestimated. And imagine living in a world in which your female colleagues just interrupt and talk over you in meetings. And imagine living in a world in which your expertise is constantly challenged by women, or in which you're often patronised by women. And imagine living in a world in which your female boss routinely promotes other women above your head, even when you think they're less competent than you. Or imagine living in a world in which you write a book and half the population are reluctant to read it because it's written by a man. Or a world in which people are reluctant to work for you because you're a man. Or a world in which you just express an opinion on social media and you get violence and death threats simply for being brave enough to say what you think. And then I say to the men in the audience, it's not great, is it? And well, now you understand what it's like to be a woman, because that's exactly what happens to us.
Oh, so powerfully put.
Thank you.
In your book, you talk about the authority gap being the mother of all gender gaps. And I think that phrase really struck me. Can you share a bit more about what you meant by that, please?
Well, I think if women aren't being taken as seriously as men, and they're assumed to be less competent than men, then they're going to be hired less readily, they're going to be promoted less fast, and they're going to be paid less. And also, it's going to dent women's confidence and make them feel less entitled to success. Because if every time you speak up at a meeting, someone just interrupts you or talks over you or dismisses what you say, or takes no notice of what you say until it's repeated by a man later in the meeting, and then it's celebrated for its brilliance. If all these things happen to you routinely, of course you're going to feel less confident. Sorry, now, in a Freudian way, I nearly said competent there. And I actually, I have a whole chapter in the book about, we mistake confidence for competence, and the two are absolutely not the same thing. And women are often less confident than men, even if they're just as competent. And the reason, one of the reasons is what I've just said, that, if you come up against this sort of behavior, which is a manifestation of the authority gap routinely, that is going to dent your confidence, isn't it? And then because we too often mistake confidence for competence, we assume the woman's not going to be as good.
Yeah. And you talk about in your book about how so many women internalize that authority gap and see it as kind of something lacking in them, that they're not smart enough or good enough or strong enough. And I can relate to that. One of what's led me to do the work that I do was I I suffered burnout and I thought it was my fault and looked at kind of all my weaknesses. And it was only through kind of really getting fiercely curious about how did this happen that all of the systemic nature of it started to show itself and become aware of it. And in your research, you came across so much data that kind of reinforces the systemic nature of the authority gap. Could you give us some kind of insight and context into that, please?
Yes, I came across so many academic studies that showed that this sort of thing happens to women all over the world, not because they're not as good, but simply because they're female. And that however senior the women are, it doesn't insulate themselves against this sort of behavior. So, for instance, I came across a fascinating study of US Supreme Court proceedings. Now, you don't get much more authoritative than being a US Supreme Court justice. But what they found by going through written transcripts of 10,000 hours of Supreme Court hearings was that although women made up only a third of all justices, they suffered two-thirds of all interruptions. So, in other words, they were 4 times more likely to be interrupted than their male colleagues, 96% of the time by men. So, even if you were Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you suffered from the authority gap. And then there was another study which looked at this phenomenon, which I'm sure a lot of women have come across, which is that you make a point at a meeting and no one takes a blind bit of notice, and then a man makes exactly the same point and is cheered to the rafters for it. And when that happens, we tend to beat ourselves up and think, oh, maybe I wasn't confident enough, or I wasn't articulate or eloquent enough. No, you were just too female. So what this study does, What this study did was it took actually a mixed gender group of people and it asked them to take a decision on a child custody case. And they deliberately chose that topic because it's actually quite female stereotyped. You'd expect women to be good at it. And they gave the group all sorts of information about the family concerned. But they gave a couple of individuals a piece of information that the rest of the group didn't have. And when that information was introduced by a man, it was 6 times more likely to be used by the group in its deliberations than when it was introduced by a woman. 6 times more likely. That's how much harder women have to fight to get their voices heard in a group. And then another study sent applications for a lab manager position to American science professors. And they sent an application letter and a CV. And these were identical, but they randomly assigned them a male or a female name at the top. And what they found was that the so-called male applicant was judged by the professors to be significantly more competent, more hireable, was offered a higher starting salary, and the professors said they were more interested in mentoring him. And this was male and female science professors. So I make the point all the way through the book, it's not just men doing this. In some cases, men are more biased than women, but quite often women are also biased against other women.
Yes, and that really came through in the book. And I think your chapter on skepticism was a really important piece to put in your book. And I think it's a really important piece to put into this interview in that, there are going to be so many women listening to this that can relate to what you've talked about in terms of the experience or that kind of subtle sense when they're in a meeting or in the workplace. But I'm sure you've encountered men who are skeptical or perhaps argue that it's justified that authority gap exists. So what do you say to someone that is a skeptic?
Well, I think, first of all, I do a whole chapter on the experience of trans people, and I think this is absolute slam dunk evidence for the existence of the authority gap. Because normally, suppose you are up for a job or for a promotion against a male rival, and he gets it and you don't. And you may suspect that bias was at play, but it's terribly hard to prove because he's a different person and he may genuinely be better than you. But if you talk to people who have lived as both genders, then you're talking about exactly the same person. And so they've got the same ability and intelligence and experience, personality, motivation, body of work. And the only thing that has changed is their gender. And so you've managed to control for all the other variables and isolate the one that matters. And if their experience is utterly different in the way they're treated once they start living in another gender, then I think that is pretty good proof that it's gender that makes the difference, not the other qualities. And so I tell a story in the book of two Stanford science professors who happened to transition in opposite directions at exactly the same time. By coincidence, they used to meet up and compare notes over lunch. And Ben Barres, who was a neuroscientist, said once he was living as a man, he said, I've had the thought a million times, I'm just taken more seriously now. He said, my work is taken more seriously. The same damned work, as he put it, is taken more seriously now that people see me as a man. And he said someone was overheard at the back of one of his seminars who didn't know his history saying, oh, Ben Barres gave a great seminar today, but then his work's so much better than his sister's, i.e. his own work, because they changed his name.
So powerful, because he really talked about, he said, now I've lived it. I really didn't see it before, but now I absolutely know it exists.
Exactly. And meanwhile, his counterpart, Joan Roughgarden, who is an evolutionary biologist, she said that when she was living as a man in academia, she said, I just felt like I was on this conveyor belt to success. And I kept being promoted and my pay kept going up. And frankly, it was all pretty easy. And she said, once I started living as a woman, all that changed. And she said she came up against all these instances of authority gap behavior, being undermined and patronized and underestimated and talked over and having to have a man repeat a point before it was taken seriously. And she said to start with, I thought, well, if I'm going to live as a woman, I'm darn well going to be discriminated against like a woman. And then she said, well, the thrill of that has worn off, I can tell you. And her conclusion, similar to mine, was a man is assumed to be competent until proven otherwise. A woman is assumed to be incompetent until she proves otherwise. And what I would say to men who don't notice the authority gap is, look, I don't blame you. It's not surprising because it doesn't affect you in the same way as it affects us. And I use the analogy of it's as if men are swimming in a river with the current, and it's a good, strong current. But of course, you can't feel the current. But they see the banks racing past them and they think, wow, I'm a really strong swimmer. And then they see the women struggling to make headway in the opposite direction against the current. And they think, why can't they swim as fast as me? Well, they're clearly not as good. Well, it's because of the current. And I do actually use a lot of evidence to prove that we are just as good as men. And everything, frankly, except upper body strength, we are just as good as men. We are just as intelligent as men. We are just as competent as men. In fact, in a lot of fields, women seem to outperform men. Women doctors get better results for their patients. Women estate agents get higher prices for their houses. There is absolutely no justification for the authority gap, except, I suppose, several thousand years of patriarchy and of religions and societies telling us men are better than women, even though they're not.
Yeah, and you talk, a lot of your research talks about children as well in the education system, how as early as, is it 6, children of both genders believe that boys are more likely to be really, really smart.
Yeah, that was really depressing. And you know where it comes from? It comes from parents, I'm afraid. So there was this really depressing study which asked parents to estimate their children's IQ. And on average, they estimated their sons at 115 and their daughters at only 107. An enormous statistical difference, despite the fact that girls actually develop faster than boys, and they have a bigger vocabulary than boys at an earlier age, and they outperform boys at school all the way from nursery through to PhD. Girls do better than boys, and yet parents still think their sons are cleverer than their daughters. And so boys are subliminally absorbing this incorrect notion that they're cleverer than girls, and girls are subliminally absorbing this incorrect notion that they're not as clever as boys. And we know that the IQ distribution for boys and girls is identical, except at the very far ends of the IQ curve. And so what this study did was it took 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. First of all, the researchers said, there's this really, really smart colleague of mine at work who knows the answers to all the questions. Which one do you think it is? And they showed them 2 photos of women and 2 photos of men. And at the age of 5, girls tended to choose one of the women and boys tended to choose one of the men. By the age of 6 and 7, boys were still choosing the men but so were a lot of the girls. So girls were starting to think by the age of 6 and 7 that really, really smart adults were more likely to be men. And then the researchers said they asked them to choose playmates for a game which needed really, really smart kids. And exactly the same thing happened. At 5, they were choosing their own gender. By 6 and 7, both genders were starting to choose boys. And then they asked them to choose playmates for a game where the kids had to try really, really hard. And then, of course, they were prepared to choose girls again. And this just plays into this stereotype that boys can be brilliant, girls can only be hardworking, conscientious, diligent, And this happens in adulthood too. So when women are evaluated or given references, the employers or the referees are much more likely to use what are called these grindstone adjectives, like she's very hardworking, she's very diligent, she's very conscientious, are much less likely to use words that they use for men, such as outstanding and talented and brilliant. There's no reason to suppose that women are any less outstanding, talented, or brilliant than men, but those are the stereotypes that still afflict us. And so it's not just parents that get this wrong, it's also teachers. So teachers have higher expectations for boys than girls in maths, for instance, and the children pick this up. Even if it's unconscious, they pick it up and start thinking that maths is a subject for boys rather than girls, and the same with science. And teachers are much more likely to call on boys than girls to answer questions in class. And so, boys will often shout out a question and the teacher will accept the answer. Sorry, I said question. Boys are much more likely than girls to shout out an answer and teachers will accept it. Whereas if girls do that, they're much more likely to be told, put your hand up if you want to answer a question. Boys are more likely to put their hands up before they even know the answer. Girls tend to wait until they're sure, by which time it's too late. But, whatever the reason, what happens is that teachers are between 7 and 8 times more likely to call on boys than girls. And what happens as a result is that boys learn this entitlement to disproportionate speaking time, which they carry through into adulthood. I mean, men talk much more than women do in public settings. And girls learn that they're going to be rewarded for being quiet and well behaved. And as a result, adult women find it much harder to speak up in meetings because that's not what they've been socialized to do. And men will tend to indulge in what I call conversational manspreading, just taking up disproportionate speaking time and then get rewarded for it.
Yes, and it's interesting, when I was reading that in your book, I've really become conscious of it with my own 2 children. I've got a 9-year-old boy and a 4-year-old daughter. And I have been picking my son up and actually sharing this with him, that when she grows up, the likelihood is that men are going to feel that they can interrupt her. So I've been really holding him to account on that. So thank you for bringing it to my attention. And I actually noticed, yeah, I also noticed that I went to my son and daughter's school. They had their assembly, their weekly assembly, where they were giving out awards. And there was a girl in the school who she's got a brother that's 2 years older, and she was up on stage getting an award, and the head teacher was asking her a question, and her brother answered the question from the audience. And she was really great at kind of just very respectfully kind of going, no, this is your sister's space. But I was, just watching this play out, you're like, this is really interesting.
Yeah, gosh, I'm so pleased that you do call your son out for it, because boys as young as 3 are more likely to interrupt girls than boys. And I think that's probably because parents interrupt their daughters more than their sons. So that's what they're role modeling for their children, that somehow what girls are saying seems less important and you have more right to chip in or to silence them than you do to boys, and boys pick up on that. So it's brilliant what you're doing.
And I think it's a natural dynamic between them. He's very quick thinking, very impulsive, where she's more slow and reflective. And so naturally, he kind of wants to fill those gaps where she's really thinking more carefully. And so I'm, really drawing attention to that now. So thank you. So obviously, we've looked at what the authority gap is and the evidence to say actually it does exist. But I imagine there might be men that will kind of go, well, if we start to address this, doesn't it just mean that we lose out? But you did a whole kind of chapter on this in your book about actually what is the impact on men if we do close the authority gap. Would you mind sharing a bit more about that, please?
Yes,
Okay.
sure, I will. And in fact, this is one of the things that cheered me most because I had feared that I was going to have to appeal to men's sense of justice, fairness, to their altruism, to say, I know this isn't in your interest, but please, it will be better for us if you did sort of relinquish a bit of power. And what I actually found from the academic research was no, it's not a zero sum game in which, as women start winning, men start losing. It's the opposite. It's a positive sum game in which both sides win. And this is actually really cheering because it means that men don't actually have to give anything up. Now, anecdotally, I have to say to any skeptical men who are listening that, there are some fabulous men out there who treat us absolutely equally, who give us equal respect, who are genuinely interested and listening to what we have to say. And we notice it immediately. I mean, we can tell within 2 minutes of meeting a man whether he's that sort of man or whether he's the sort of guy who thinks he's far more interesting than we are, who can't be bothered to ask us a question about ourselves, who's just sort of solipsistic. And boy, do we prefer the former. We really appreciate them. And so if you act in that sort of way with women, they will like you more, they will respect you more. If you treat them like that at work, they will be more engaged and more loyal. I mean, basically, everything will be better for you as well as for them if that's the way you act. But also, what the academic research shows is that both in more gender equal countries and societies, but also in more gender equal relationships, straight relationships, that is, where the man and the woman share the chores at home pretty equally and share the childcare equally, not only are the women happier and healthier, which you would expect, and the children are happier and healthier, and they do better at school, and they have fewer behavioral difficulties, and the girls are more ambitious for themselves, the boys are less likely to get into trouble, and they all get on better with their dad. So all that's great. But also the men themselves are happier and healthier. So they're twice as likely to say that they're satisfied with their lives. They're half as likely to get depressed, much less likely to divorce, and they tend to drink less, to smoke less, to take fewer drugs, to get better sleep at night. And here, guys, is the absolute clincher: they get more frequent and better sex. Which isn't surprising because the women are going to be less tired, less resentful, and happier in their relationships. So, guys, what's not to like? This is really in your interest too.
Yeah, and that really came through in your research that actually women having equal authority is of benefit to everybody and it kind of individuals and cultural and society. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, because I also talk about how, companies with more women at the top actually earn better returns for their shareholders. Parliaments with more women in them pass more laws on things like climate change and also pay more attention and spend more money on health and education and less on defense, So there's a lot for society to gain as well.
And you dived into one part, I think it was in chapter 5, where you talk about women's experience of imposter syndrome using the lens of the authority gap. And I thought this was such an insightful chapter that I know that my listeners are particularly going to love. And you talk about that women leaders are twice as likely to experience it than men. Can you share a bit more about what your research highlighted in this area, please?
Yes, I mean, women are just generally less confident than men. And as I said earlier, it's not surprising because of the way we get treated. And, we're always sort of being challenged and undermined and underestimated. So we're bound to feel less good about ourselves. But I think it starts much earlier on in childhood. So if you look at a bunch of boys playing and socializing together, most of it consists of a sort of boastful competitiveness. It's, oh, I scored more goals this season than you, or my dad's got a better car than yours. And this continues into adulthood, seeing a bunch of men in the pub, they're going to be showing each other photos of, the great car they've just bought or the gorgeous model they've dated or whatever. And that's how they bond, through this sort of competitiveness. How girls and women bond is exactly the opposite. So we do it through modesty and self-deprecation. So, if you're a girl talking to a bunch of other girls, you're going to be saying, "Oh God, I hate my hair," or "I'm useless at maths," or "My bum's too big," and that's how they bond, is through admitting vulnerability. And if a girl were to behave like a boy in a group of other girls, she would immediately be ostracized. Okay. Now, this then continues into adulthood. So we have been socialized to do ourselves down, and men have been socialized to big themselves up. So no wonder we're more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome than they are. Because we're constantly going to be thinking, oh God, am I good enough? Oh no, I'm not good enough. Oh no, I don't meet all the criteria for this job. Whereas men are going to think, of course I'm good enough. I'm bloody brilliant. I mean, not all men, of course. And, men can suffer from lack of confidence too. But on average, men are much more likely to be confident and quite often overconfident. So they're much more likely to over-assess their abilities than women are. When you get them to take a maths test, for instance, men will quite often say in advance that they're going to do better than they do, and even say afterwards they thought they did better than they actually did, whereas women do the opposite. Women are more likely to be accurate, which I would have thought would be a desirable character trait. There was a great study done, unusually for an academic journal, entitled Bullshitters. Who are they and what do we know about their lives? And it took 15,000 teenagers in 9 different countries, and they showed them 16 mathematical concepts and asked them to rate them on a scale of 0 to 10, how much they understood the concept and how confident they were in applying it in maths. And unbeknown to the teenagers, the researchers had inserted 3 mathematical concepts that didn't exist. They were completely fake. So there was proper numbers, declarative fractions, and subjunctive scaling. And in all 9 countries, teenage boys were far more likely than teenage girls to say of these fake concepts, oh yes, completely understand it, completely confident in applying it in maths, even though they didn't exist. And the bullshitters, the ones who said that, were also much more likely to overrate their own mathematical ability.
So boys were more likely to say that they'd encountered these fake kind of mathematical theories and were better at it, even though they never even existed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, all this shows is that boys and men are much more likely to overestimate their competence and also to blag and to pretend they know more than they do. And the trouble is that we often then take them at their word. And also, because men are allowed to self-promote and women aren't, we don't like women who self-promote. We find it really distasteful. If you ask what sounds like a very innocuous question at a job interview, like, so tell me the achievement you're proudest of. Now, a woman might well think, oh God, they won't like me if I'm self-promoting. So she'll think, she'll say something like, oh, well, my 2 lovely children, couldn't be prouder of them. And the interviewer will think, oh, that's sweet. And then the male candidate will say, well, in my last job, I doubled sales and I quadrupled profit margins. And they'll think, oh, fantastic. Well, he's obviously the one we need to hire.
Yes. And you talk about in your book, actually, that this starts kind of in that early socialization at school, about schools being a confidence factory for boys, but a competence factory for girls. And that phrase really struck me as well.
That's right. Girls are rewarded for being diligent and hardworking and being, good at their exams, and boys are rewarded for blagging. And blagging can be a very useful character trait in later life. Putting your hand up before you know the answer to the question, but thinking, well, I'll get by. It's a bit like taking a corner a bit too fast, but I'll be okay. And I think men are trained to do that in a way that women aren't.
Yes. And I love the piece you said about perhaps instead of sending women on assertiveness training, we should send men on humility and bullshit avoidance courses. And I thought, yes.
Absolutely. But can I also talk about how assertiveness training, I mean, that was a good joke, but genuinely assertiveness training is not going to work. It's not going to solve the problem, at least, for
yes,
women.
Please do, because I'd got a question on this. So this is the perfect timing for that, actually.
Okay. So people quite often say, well, if it's just a question of confidence, let's just help women to be more confident and let's just help women to be more confident and the problem will be solved. Well, if only it were that easy. Tragically, it isn't. Because the problem is that if a woman does act as confidently and as assertively as her male colleagues in order to be taken seriously, we're quite likely to recoil from her and feel very uncomfortable and start disliking her. And we'll start using adjectives about her such as abrasive or strident or aggressive or bossy, overbearing, scary, stern, controlling, even bitchy, ball breaking. And these are all adjectives that are never used of men displaying exactly the same character traits. So, if a male CEO is described as tough, we think he's admirable. If a female CEO is described as tough, we think she's a bitch. Now, why is this? It's because women in those circumstances are going against these incredibly traditional and outdated stereotypes that still lurk in the deeper recesses of our brains that tell us that women ought to be kind and gentle and warm and nurturing and unassuming and unassertive and unthreatening and uncompetitive and unself-promoting. Whereas men are supposed to be confident and assertive and dominant and being in charge and showing leadership. But the trouble is that if women act according to those very outdated stereotypes, no one's going to listen to a word they say. They're not going to be taken at all seriously. And so either they're not confident enough and they're disrespected, or they are confident enough and they're disliked. Now, this is a terrible double bind for women, and it's really difficult to get over, but it can be got over, you'll be glad to hear, with quite a lot of work. And what both the academic evidence and the experience of all these women I interviewed showed is that the only way through is to project warm authority. So you have to overlay oodles of warmth on top of your personality in order to be taken seriously and not disliked at the same time, in order not to be a threat, particularly to men, but to women as well. And it's quite exhausting, this. Women have to smile much more. They have to use humor more. They have to read the room very carefully, be very emotionally intelligent, try not to tread on any men's egos. And it's exhausting, and it's a skill that not all women have. And why should they have to? Because men don't have to. And, it's a burden that men simply don't have to bear. And it means that only the very best women manage to get through and get to the top, because not only are they highly intelligent and competent, but they also got a very high EQ, a high level of emotional intelligence. And this is something we don't demand from men in the same way.
Yeah, and it can be, can't it? You think, actually, we've got all this undermining going on, which I loved that term. And as you say, about in that right ratio of confidence and warmth. So you're taken seriously, but you're not disliked. So it would be easy to kind of listen to this kind of context and think, oh God, we're just up against
Let's go and slit our wrists.
Yeah, you can feel helpless and hopeless, but you do a lot in your book to talk about, actually, there are absolutely things that we can do, and you break those down into different areas. So what we can do personally, what we can do if we're as a partner, as if we're parents. Would you mind sharing some of those strategies? Because I know that my listeners love kind of practical stuff that either they can do for themselves or they can share with others that can make the difference as well.
Well, I think the most important thing is that we all have to recognize that however liberal or intelligent or even female we are, the chances are we harbor this unconscious bias against women. I mean, even I do, and I've written a whole book about it. But we shouldn't feel ashamed of it. It's called unconscious for a reason. We don't do it on purpose, and we can't put a lid on it. But what we can do is notice as soon as it manifests itself and then correct for it. So I will find sometimes, perhaps I'm listening to a young woman being interviewed on the radio, and maybe she's got quite a high voice and sounds a bit childish in the way that men can't because their voices break. And my instant reaction might sometimes be, wonder if she knows what she's talking about. And then I'll go, no, stop it. Judge her by the content of what she's saying, not by the pitch of her voice. Because I've learnt to spot when this manifests itself in my conscious brain, and then I do something about it. So that would be the fundamental thing I would say. Notice if when you walk up to a man and a woman standing together, you automatically address the man first. Stop doing it. Notice if you're interrupting women more than men. Notice if you're listening a bit less attentively to them in meetings than to men. I mean, Christine Lagarde talks about how when she chairs meetings, when a woman starts talking, the men often start surreptitiously checking their emails on their phones under the table. And she calls them out for it. This is the sort of thing we need to notice. But as partners and as parents, there is so much we can do. So it's really important as partners that that this is in straight relationships, that the man respects the woman equally, respects her right to have a career as much as his, if that's what she wants, because they are going to be role modeling once they have children. They're going to be role modeling to children what the roles of men and women are in society. What you see from your mother and father is your first and most important imprint of how you see men and women in later life. And so if you two have equal authority at home, that is going to make an enormous difference to how children see the roles of women and men in later life. And it's very important that you don't gender stereotype the play that they do and the chores that you ask them to do. Don't assume that, your daughter isn't going to want to play with Lego or your son's not going to want to play with dolls. Interestingly, boys are as keen on playing with dolls as girls until the age of 18 months. And then I suspect what happens is that parents, particularly fathers, start policing them and saying, oh, no, that's not a toy for boys. So we can do a lot there. And we can also, as you were saying earlier, just look at their behavior. Make sure that sons, your son isn't interrupting your daughter, is respecting her equally, is respecting girls at school equally. Hang on a moment.
And as you're saying that, it's making me think of a friend of mine was telling me a story that her son came home from school and said to her, Mummy, did you know that a man could marry a man? And they'd been learning about same-sex relationships at school. And she was like, yes, darling, yeah. And he went, but who does the washing up?
Oh,
he had this massive realization that what he was seeing role modeled in the house was that she did the domestic work, and therefore if there was two men, who would do the domestic work? And it really was like this stark aha moment of, oh wow, we need to readdress this because we are not role modeling kind of what we want to be.
How fascinating. Actually, a woman interviewed me recently about this, and she said, I brought up my children absolutely equally. So why is it that my 3-year-old daughter wants to help me with the washing up and my son never does? And I said, well, is it always you who does the washing up? Oh, she said, I hadn't thought of that. So you're absolutely right. And I think one really important thing is not to praise girls for being pretty and boys for what they can do. And we do that so much just without thinking about it. I used to do it. Now I've noticed it. I've stopped. And so I'll never now say to a girl, oh, how pretty you look, or what a pretty dress. And to a boy, look how far you can kick the ball. I will try to even it up, because otherwise what happens is that we are praising girls for being ornamental and boys for being instrumental. And that makes them grow up thinking that the girls' value lies in looking good and boys' value lies in doing well. And we really shouldn't be instilling that in our children, but we just so often do, I'm afraid.
Oh, and I have to catch myself. I find myself saying to my daughter, you are beautiful and strong and brave and powerful. And I kind of follow it up and I'm like, oh God, because it just rolls out of my mouth. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, as you say, it's that unconscious kind of response.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sorry, I had another idea there, oh yes. One common thread that I found went all the way through the interviews I did with these very successful women, because I asked them all about their childhoods, was, where do you think your confidence came from and your belief that you could succeed in a male world? And almost to a woman, they said, my father really believed in me. And I thought, how fascinating, not my parents, but my father. So I think fathers have a very special role to play with daughters, to make them think that, if my father believes in me, that somehow gives me license to succeed among other men.
Oh, that is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you also talked to colleagues what we can do.
Yes, there's a huge amount we can do as colleagues. And I think the most important thing we can do is be allies to female colleagues, whether we're a man or a woman. And so if a woman has this sort of bad behavior happen to her, and it does happen all too frequently, like being interrupted or having her views ignored until a man repeats them, it's hard for her to stick up for herself, because if she does, she knows she's likely to be punished for it. And people will say, oh God, isn't she paranoid or oversensitive or difficult or tricky? What she needs is for other people to stand up for her. So suppose I'm at a meeting in which you've just been interrupted, then I can say, oh, hang on, I was really interested in what Nikki was saying there. Or suppose you make a point and no one takes any notice. 10 minutes later, a man repeats it and gets all the credit. I can say, oh, I'm so glad you agreed with what Nikki said earlier. And indeed, the other thing that women can do, or anyone can do indeed, is amplify what women say at meetings. So men are very likely to amplify, the research shows that men are very likely to amplify what other men say. In other words, to say, oh yes, John's made a great point there, I really agree with it. Less likely to amplify what women say. And I'm afraid that women are also less likely to amplify what women say. And so the onus is really on us to say, oh, yes, Nikki, I really agree with that. I really think we should do that, because no one else is going to. You even see this happening in childhood, that, the popular boys in school will tend to have sort of sidekicks, other boys who'll laugh at all their jokes, and big them up. And the popular girls don't tend to have sidekicks in the same way. It's not the way we're socialized. And so we have to be other women's sidekicks.
Love that. And I think there was a piece of, you talked about the research that if a woman is on stage and invites questions from the audience, actually, if you can start with a question from a woman, there's more likelihood then that other women will speak up and ask questions.
That's right. And I always do that. If I'm doing a Q&A after a talk, I will always call on a woman first to ask the first question, because that will give us more gender balance later.
And I hadn't realised that. And I thought, well, actually, that's something that I'm going to start doing as well. So thank you for that. And then you also talk more widely, actually, if you're an employer, what you can do.
Oh, yes. I mean, of course, it goes without saying that we need equal paid parental leave for men and for women, and use it or lose it for men. So they can't just hand it over to the mother. That will make an enormous difference, because at the moment, employers are likely to discriminate against any woman of childbearing age, because they'll think, oh, well, if I employ her, she'll just go off and have children and take loads of time out, and it will be really inconvenient for me. If men are just as likely as women to take parental leave when the family has a baby, then the employer can't discriminate against anyone aged between 20 and 40. And so that hugely levels the playing field for women. And it also levels the playing field for them once they're in a job, if their male colleagues are just as likely to take time out as they are. So that's the very first thing I think employers should do. The next thing they should do, I think, is to get as many of their female employees into a room together as they can, without any men in the room, and guarantee them anonymity. And then ask them to talk about, does this sort of behavior happen at this organization? Do you find your voice is heard as much as men's? Do you find you're interrupted more? Do you find your competence is underestimated? All this sort of thing. And then draw all the evidence together, take it to the senior management and say, is this the sort of culture we want in our organization? And if not, let's do something about it. And there is so much you can do. And I think, managers need to be rewarded for, for making that culture disappear in their branch of the organization. They need to know this is something that senior management really cares about, and that it won't be tolerated. Yes.
And it's just making me think, I think, is it London Fire Brigade have just released a report this week around the misogynistic racism and sexism, and you get the impression, or you hope, that with what they've discovered, there's going to be a real cultural systemic shift, because I imagine that if you go into a lot of organizations, there would be, maybe not to that degree, but who knows, of feedback that you would get if you had that ability to share really what women's experiences are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also talk a lot, there are all sorts of systemic things that employers can do to try to get rid of the bias that is always there in hiring and promotion decisions. So things like having only one woman on a selection panel, interview panel, actually reduces the chances of a female candidate being hired. Because what happens is the men think, oh, we don't have to worry about any of this diversity nonsense, the women will take care of that. And the woman thinks, if I recommend we hire the female candidate, the men will think I'm being nepotistic. So it actually reduces the chances of a woman being hired.
Oh, interesting. And you talk about perhaps using blind CVs and very structured interview processes to kind of remove as much as possible of that unconscious bias. But one of the things, somebody that you interviewed, and I can't remember the name of the person you interviewed, but it was, I I think it was one of the senior gentlemen in the army was talking about he actually has a female reverse mentor.
Yes, this is General Sir Nick Carter, who was in charge of the whole armed forces. He was chief of the defence staff. He had a more junior female reverse mentor, and it was brilliant. She was a woman from the MOD, a very bright civil servant, and she would watch how he conducted himself at meetings and tell him afterwards, I don't think you gave that woman enough chance to speak, or you spoke, you talked over her, or you weren't listening properly. And he said it completely opened his eyes. He had no idea he was doing this. And I do recommend that.
I thought that was brilliant. And then you obviously talk about how this then goes wider into our society. We've touched on teaching, but you also talk about your profession, journalism and governments and society. So I don't know if you could share just a couple of pointers from that more kind of cultural perspective.
Well, I think the media are incredibly important in perpetuating the authority gap. Every time you see an old authoritative man on TV flanked by a pretty young woman, as a sort of co-presenter, what you're subliminally being told is that men are the people who know stuff and women are people who are sort of junior and decorative. And not having nearly as many older women on screen as older men, I think, is really damaging for the authority gap, because we are losing the voice of wise, authoritative older women, whereas men can have faces that are so wrinkled they look like a relief map of the Scilly Isles, and they're still allowed on telly, and women get sacked as soon as they show the first wrinkle. And I think this is really damaging. But also having more female experts in the media is a big help. So, at the moment, something like only 20% of experts quoted in news stories are female, 80% are men. Well, that gives us the idea that men are 4 times more expert than women, which they're not. And some newspapers and broadcasting organizations have really taken steps only in the last few years to remedy this and to bring it closer to 50-50. And that, I think, is fantastic. That will make a big difference. But I also think we need more female commentators. So The Guardian, for instance, has 50-50 female, op-ed columnists, opinion columnists. The Times, I think there are 2 or 3 times as many men as women. So what message is that sending people who are reading it? Men know more, men have more authority, men's opinions are more important than women's. There's a lot that the media can do. And it's the same also in fiction, in drama, TV, drama and films. If men are always the sort of agentic characters, the ones, doing stuff and being adventurous and being the main part, and women are always there as sort of sex objects and helpmeets and murder victims, that's not going to send a very good message either, is it? So I think it's been brilliant that, again, only in the last few years, it's very recent, we've started to see many more TV series and films with women as complex, interesting main characters, not as just sort of, number twos.
And I love the work that Reese Witherspoon's actually doing. There was that speech that she gave when she got an award, and she talked about actually, I'm all about kind of creating films that have a complex female lead that isn't kind of looking to the man to rescue her, but she's saving herself and is her own heroine in her own kind of story. And I thought that was so powerful.
Yeah. I think, didn't she produce Big Little Lies, which was basically all interesting, complex female characters? Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you. We have covered so much, Mary Ann, and I just want to thank you for the work that you've done in putting this book and your research together, because I know that my audience listening to this will take so much away from it. Knowing that if they've experienced unconscious bias, to know that they're not alone and it's not their fault, but to understand the kind of the water that we're swimming in that we may not even be aware of. And then actually what we can do about that, both at an individual, but across like the systemic layers of it. And I think you talk about, the big piece is stop mistaking confidence for competence. And that really struck me in this work about actually, if we as a society can stop looking at confidence as that view that somebody clearly has got more authority and competence, that really starts to break this down.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. So if people want to find out more about you, your book, your work, where would you point them to?
Well, my website is maryannsieghart.com, but actually you don't need to know how to spell that, because if you do theauthoritygap.com, it will take you there as well. And I'm on Instagram as M.A. Sieghart Writer, and on Twitter as M.A. Sieghart, and LinkedIn, all the usual channels, basically. And you can also follow The Authority Gap on Facebook.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your insights with us.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure, Nikki. Thanks so much for having me on.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too. So if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.